The content of this podcast has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It is educational in nature and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or supplement is right for you. Any supplements mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of the guest or host are their own and may not reflect those of Advanced Orthomolecular Research Incorporated. Hello and welcome to Supplementing Health, a podcast presented by Advanced Orthomolecular Research. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Herkel. This show is all about applying evidence-based and effective dietary, lifestyle, and natural health product strategies for your optimal health. We are going to feature some very engaging clinicians and experts from the world of functional and naturopathic medicine to help achieve our mission to empower people to lead their best lives naturally. This episode of Supplementing Health is brought to you by AOR's Vitamin D3 Liquid. This vegan formula, sourced from lichen, supports immune function and calcium absorption. It's formulated for maximum absorbability and has a neutral flavor, making it effortless to take. Vitamin D3 Liquid is available in 2 adult sizes and a child size. Look for it today at your local health retailer or at aor.ca or aor.us. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Supplementing Health. My name is Dr. Paul Herkel. I'm your host. As always, we're here to talk about things and questions that you have on your mind that have anything to do with natural health. And today we're going to talk about one of the most commonly used supplements, vitamin D. And to help me with this conversation, I have a good friend of mine, Chantal Dumas, who's a naturopath. We've worked together for the last 10 years, and she's been a naturopath in Montreal, in Quebec, Canada, for the last 22 years. So she has a huge wealth of experience that she brings to this conversation. So I'm super excited to have her joining us. Welcome, Chantal.
Good morning, Paul. It's a pleasure, and thank you for that nice introduction.
You know, some things that you're involved with, I think is just, I think the listeners need to understand that, you know, you're fluent in 3 languages. You've been working in French, English, and Spanish. You've been connected with, as a consultant with some of the healthcare endeavors in Cuba. And, you know, some of the things that they're doing down there is really, you know, cutting edge in terms of integrating, you know, natural health things like curcumin or curcuma, the herb that is found in turmeric, or that is turmeric. Why don't you tell us just a quick little bit about some of the cool things that you're doing there?
Well, as most people would know, Cuba has suffered tremendously because of the American embargo that's preventing them from having access to a lot of the medications that we use. So they've managed to turn that challenge into pretty much an opportunity because they have integrated the traditional and complementary approaches within the conventional system. So they use, for example, acupuncture, they use hypnotherapy, and every conventional doctor has basic understanding of medicinal herbs and some of the complementary approaches. But of course, they do not have access to the same technology that we do. So they're still in the process of turning the traditional knowledge into a more scientific approach. Like, for example, we would use standardized extracts, we would use different form of supplements, but for them, it would be mostly herbal teas or tinctures. So they're still in the process of, I would say, adopting the scientific paradigm and integrating that into the traditional approaches. So that's where I've been helping them as a consultant, and mostly on setting up trials involving curcuma. So we're using indigenous curcuma, as well as we've also started different curcuma fields in different locations in Cuba to see the different components we would get in different part of the island. So it's really, really exciting work.
That's really fascinating. And sometimes, as you said before, the opportunity comes up in an unexpected way, but it forces them to be innovative. And I've heard the reputation that Cuba has as being a very forward-thinking medical system. You think, yeah, in many ways, Cuba's a third world country, but they have, they have a pretty good medical system from what I understand.
Well, they do, and that's very fascinating when you look at the statistics, for example, because, like you said, they are a third world country in terms of economy, but in terms of living standards and healthcare, they rank among the top. So
Yeah.
that's really quite remarkable. And one of the things I appreciate the most, like you said, they're forward thinking and they're very open. So it's a very problem based approach. Like we would sit together, you would have people from different discipline. For example, when they were facing the chikungunya epidemics, I was part of that think tank, and they just use what works. So if you have something to bring up to the table with homeopathy, they're not going to be this big debate about, is this and that. Like they're going to try it. They're going to try it.
Yeah.
And if it works, they're going to do it. So that's what I really, really appreciate. It's a little bit outside of the usual dogma, if I can say it that way.
Well, you have to be innovative, and I know that's in along the way that we think in terms of naturopaths. So today what we are going to talk about is vitamin D, and it's a supplement that I'm sure everybody's taken at some point. Probably I would say the most popular supplement. It's available in every store that sells either food or supplements that would have natural health products. And one of my missions as a naturopathic doctor and an educator, and one of the missions of Supplementing Health, this podcast, is to help people understand the things that we use every single day. And I've done a show on magnesium in the past as an example. How do we use them better? So I really appreciate you bringing your experience in both treating neurodevelopmental disorders when you're a clinician, and as well as women's health as being a big focus of yours. So why don't we start with the basics of vitamin D, and then we're going to get to some of the things that will help people apply this vitamin in a very specific and practical way. So let's talk about the forms of vitamin D. A lot of people don't know this, but there's actually various forms of vitamin D. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, there are two main forms of vitamin D2 or gocalciferol, which is the form that we find in plants such as mushrooms. And there's vitamin D3, which is then produced by animals. So we find it in animal sources such as fish, butter, cheese, milk. That's also the form that we would find in fortified foods. The interesting thing about vitamin D, I mean, there's a few different interesting things, but one of the interesting thing is the fact that it's not technically a vitamin because, as you know,
Yeah, I've heard
Paul, a
that.
vitamin is a substance that is essential to life that we need to obtain from our food. But vitamin D, our body can produce it endogenously. So we don't have to rely solely on our food source. So technically, it's more like a hormone than it is a vitamin because our body can make it. Our body makes it from cholesterol precursor, and it's under the action of ultraviolet B light that is emitted by the sun. So sun exposure, it's been demonized over the past few years. I was never one of those. I've always I've always loved my sunlight, but
Mhm.
sun is very interesting and important for that production, that endogenous production of vitamin D.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We are kind of conditioned to think that it's a vitamin because it's called a vitamin and that we consume it orally. But, when I see vitamin D deficiency in my patients, which I test almost all of them, especially in my focus in my practices is chronic pain. There's been a lot of research studies looking at the deficiency of vitamin D in chronic pain. And we usually think of vitamin D for bone health, right? And I know that's the most common one. But it has a lot more to do than just bone health, right? And I look at vitamin D as a deficiency in sunshine almost. It's like because that's the way it's produced. So what you're saying is that sunshine exposure is actually good for you, right?
It absolutely is. And of course, the amount of vitamin D we produce depends on different factors, one of them being our skin pigmentation. So, of course, skin exposure has to be done, I would say, rationally. So, we don't go at full sunshine between noon and 2 p.m., for example, without protection if we have fair skin. I have more of an olive complexion. So, even like, for example, when I work in Cuba, I proceed to gradual exposure and I know my tolerance level. So we have to be not wanting to create another problem by solving one. So, yes, sun exposure is important, but we have to do it based on our personal tolerance. But you were very right in mentioning we usually think of vitamin D in terms of bone health. And that's good because at least we know about vitamin D, but that's also very restrictive because, like you've mentioned, vitamin D is involved in so many things. Like there are over 2,800 vitamin D receptors, and that's the ones we know of thus far. And vitamin D affects directly 229 genes. A lot of these
Wow.
genes are involved in regulating our immune functions. So I'm having this thought all the time, every time I'm hearing now, especially with COVID-19, that we might have another wave when it's going to be the fall because it's the time when we have influenza. But, that's also regulated with our sunshine exposure. So it's not
Right.
like viruses decide to come and visit us at specific times of the year. It's also because our immunity is not as performing during the winter months because we're not as exposed to sun. And so our vitamin D level goes down. So very good that you're testing all your patients, but then arises the problem with what is the level we are aiming at. Because again,
Of
if
course,
we
yeah.
are only thinking of vitamin D in terms of bone health, we're not going to have the same standards or the same expectations for the level of vitamin D as if we understand that we don't want to just have the minimum level so that we don't have bone problems. We want to have an optimal level of vitamin D so that all these other functions, such as our immune system, our moods, again, the winter blues is very closely linked to our sun exposure as well. So there are a lot of functions for vitamin D outside strictly bone metabolism, although it's very well known and very important. But vitamin D is so much more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the most important things to remember for everybody listening is that vitamin D is important for regulating so many bodily processes. Anything, as you mentioned just in the last couple minutes, mood, immunity, and inflammation. I mentioned chronic pain and all those different things that I just mentioned, they may have different levels in the blood that has been associated in the research. And I think most of the standards, especially here in Canada where we are associated with what's the bare minimum blood level that you need for bone health. So
Exactly.
let's talk about vitamin D testing because I think that's one that I advocate a lot for. What are some of the levels that we're looking for? I know that in my patients, it definitely the cutoff in conventional labs is about 75 nanomoles per liter here in Canada using Canadian units. But I've seen you need to get over 100 to get some of the cellular differentiation, which is a cancer risk, and other immune function benefits.
Yes, absolutely. Health Canada, as we all know, is very conservative in terms of vitamin recommendations. So, according to them, the levels of vitamin D cutoff would be 50 nanomole per liter, and that would be considered sufficient. When we are below 30, that's when they considered a frank deficiency.
Right.
But to them, anywhere above 50 is optimal. And like you mentioned, scientifically speaking, there's this group of doctors in the US, about 50 scientifics, part of that grassroots health nutrient research. And they've done thousands of tests and they're really focusing on the different benefits and aspects of vitamin D. And according to them, we want to attain that range that's between 100 and 150. My clinical experience is that for most people, they would feel optimal, I would say around 120. So that's usually what I aiming at. And we'll get into like how much supplement do we need to get to that level. And again, it depends on the variety of factors, a lot of them being genetic predispositions. But
Yes.
I find at 5,000 IUs, we're talking adults and average person, but I find at 5,000 IUs per day, the average adult will reach that 100, 125 by the time the spring comes. And that's another problem we have with vitamin D. People tend to stop taking their vitamin D during the summer months. Now, as we know, many people have been enculturated to be afraid of the sun, and even in the summertime, they don't get much sun exposure.
Yeah, it's true.
So,
And they're wearing sunblock all the time, right? Every single cream that they have on has like a 15 SPF, right?
yeah, exactly. So then now I'm seeing a lot of people being vitamin D deficient during the summertime because they stop taking the supplements and they're not going outside. So,
Right.
but yeah, so the testing is very important because again, people will say, well, I'm taking this much, I'm taking that much, but depending on your ability to use, transport, and utilize the vitamin D, different people will need different level to reach that 100 mark in their blood. So again, it depends, for example, last summer, I was going outside pretty much every day. By the end of the summer, I had a beautiful tan. And when I did my testing, I was a little bit below 100. I think I was at 92, 94. And that was very surprising to me because I was exposed to a lot of sun. Now, vitamin D for me is the supplement that make the most difference, whether I take my supplement or don't take my supplements. Vitamin D is a huge one for me. And now when I did my blueprint testing, I understood why, because of all the genetic variations I could have on the way I use vitamin D, I pretty much had all of them. So now I understand why vitamin D is so crucial for me and why I need high dose of vitamin D to feel optimum. So again, that's that notion of having the strict minimum so that you don't have rickets and having an optimal dosage where your mood is great, your hormones, your pain level, your immune system. So we want to be functioning at our optimal level, and for that we need optimal level of nutrients, whether from our food or supplements such as the vitamin D.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Chantal. You touched on a number of them. First of all, for those people that are listening that haven't heard of the Blueprint test, that is, it's a genetic test, a nutrigenomic test that is assessing how your body, from a genetic level, will use a vitamin like vitamin D and many other things, anything from vitamin A to food sensitivities to the way that your body detoxifies. So it's a test that's available, simple saliva swab. It's available through aor.ca if anybody's interested in learning more about it. But that's a phenomenal point. It's not just enough to take vitamin D. You need to be tested, and then you need to be retested to see, is the level that you're taking actually getting in? And I've seen so many times with my patients that a person ends up being deficient or they're insufficient, and then we retest them and they're taking what would be considered a high dose, like you already mentioned, and they still are not in the optimal levels. Now, vitamin D needs to be activated in the body by the kidneys and by the liver. So there's multiple steps and processes. It's not as simple as, oh, I'm taking my 1 drop of vitamin D a day. You need to go about it in a very evidence-based way. In this particular case, the best suggestion that we can make is that work with somebody that has an understanding with this, like a naturopathic doctor that can give you the suggestions on the right and safe dosing, and that can track some of the testing for you. So obviously all the doses we're talking about over and above Health Canada's upper limit of 1,000 IU we always recommend you working with a healthcare provider that is knowledgeable in this. And then the other thing I want to point out that I thought was so phenomenal that you just made, Chantal, is that there are benefits to sunlight exposure over and above vitamin D. And this is something that isn't talked about very often when we talk about vitamin D, but one of the main reasons that we want to get sunlight exposure is vitamin D formation, converting that pre-cholesterol form into vitamin D. But there are other things of being exposed to the sun that we don't fully understand that still have impact. So I think that's, if you're deficient in vitamin D, the best thing you can do is being exposed to sunlight in a safe way, like we mentioned. And then secondly, then look at ways of supplementing with vitamin D. So one of the questions I get all the time, Chantal, is, can you get vitamin D in diet? I see that, my milk has vitamin D fortified. What do you think?
Well, again, do we want to have the bare minimum so we don't have rickets, or we want to have an optimal level so that all these 229 genes that are dependent on vitamin D can be activated? And I think that's something we need to change in our paradigm from going to a disease-based system and an optimal health-based system. I just want to go back, Paul, onto the testing idea,
Yeah,
because
sure, go ahead.
I don't know how it is in Ontario, but in Quebec, it's getting harder to get blood testing for vitamin D, and unless you are at risk for osteoporosis, most medical doctors do not add the vitamin D test to your requisition. And so I just want to make it clear that my blueprint will not provide the level of vitamin D you currently have in your blood, because, as you mentioned, it's a saliva swab. So it will talk about the predisposition or your potential need for vitamin D. So, for example, in my case, I know that I need more than the average person because I have problem in these activation or metabolization process, like you've mentioned. So because of that, if I start with the same 1,000 IUs as the average person, I will not get the end result that I need. But to know exactly what that end result is, we need to have a blood test done. So those two tests would work in complementarity. So you have my blueprint that you do once so that you have an accurate blueprint of your predisposition, and then you still have to do regular, I would say at least once a year, you have to do a blood test to find out what your level is. And now you were talking about, is vitamin D in food enough? And it isn't. And there are different studies that have been made. For example, when people take the recommended 800 IUs from Health Canada, and very few people actually can reach an optimal level in their blood, even if we're taking, like we've mentioned, the 50 nanomole per liter that Health Canada considers sufficient, which is way below the average scientific standards. But let's say even if we took that 50 nanomole per liter, we still have nearly 40% of the Canadian population that is below that. Now, if we go to that 100 to 150 range, which is what most scientific researchers would tell is the optimal level, now we're over 93% of the Canadian population that doesn't reach that level. So what does that mean? That means that with diet alone, we're far, far, far from reaching the minimal. It's very difficult to have enough. And one of the reasons is, like you said, because there are several steps involved in the activation of vitamin D, and you can have predisposition that impedes you to make these transformation efficiently anywhere along the path.
Yeah, totally. I was just looking at that. I think an important thing for people to understand is majority of people walking around are deficient or suboptimal in vitamin D. So getting it through fortification, whether it's through a cereal or whether it's through milk, first and foremost, usually that is with vitamin D2, which is the ergocalciferol, which is not a very bioavailable form of vitamin D. You want to be looking, and we'll talk about dosing in just a minute, but you want to be looking at getting the vitamin D3, which is closest to the form that your body normally uses. And then at that point, the body still has to convert it a number of times. And you mentioned that we have a number of genetic choke points that could be limiting not just the conversion of vitamin D and the activation, which we've just talked about, but also the absorption in your digestive system. So I want to talk about that just for a second. Vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin. And what are some of the obstacles that people could be facing? They could be that impede the absorption of vitamin D. They could be taking even a Health Canada recommended dose, but their levels are just not budging. So what are some of the considerations and obstacles that people are facing with that, Chantal?
Well, the first ones are the genetic predisposition, like we've mentioned. Then, like you've said, it's a fat-soluble vitamin. So how efficient are you in digesting and absorbing those fats? For example, if you're taking proton pump inhibitors or any kind of antacid medication, it's going to challenge your ability to use fats, and therefore any kind of vitamins that's being transported and absorbed through fat. So your ability to produce bile as well. Bile is made out of water. So are you dehydrated, right? You need 750 ml of water every day just to produce sufficient bile. And bile is that substances that your body produces in order to emulsify fat so that you can absorb them efficiently. Now, bile is also made of substances such as taurine. So if you're deficient in any ingredient that goes into bile production, you might have a poor bile quality. Enzymes, do you have sufficient enzymes to absorb your vitamin D? So these are all things happening in your digestive system that can have an interference. I've mentioned proton pump inhibitors, but statin drugs, anything that affects the way you're using your cholesterol will have an impact.
Yeah, the number one most prescribed medication in the world is statins. And what do? They inhibit cholesterol. And what's vitamin D made out of? Cholesterol. So that's a no-brainer.
But people don't realize that. And even over-the-counter medication, like antacid medication, people think they're not loaded with consequences because they're available over the counter. But think about it. If you're suppressing that acid production in your stomach, then your ability to absorb not only fats and fat-soluble vitamins, but minerals will be affected, proteins will be affected. And yes, there are consequences. It hurts when you're having acid reflux, but there are other solutions. And you need to, address the cause, because just taking antacid medication on a regular basis to suppress the symptoms without addressing the cause has consequences. And one of them is going to affect your vitamin D absorption.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to mention a couple others that I see in my practice. Anybody that has any sort of autoimmune, like celiac disease that is affecting the digestive system, inflammatory bowel disease, the research is very clear that this population of people don't absorb their nutrients as well. Think of any inflammation and food sensitivities. We don't really know what that is doing to our body's ability to absorb things. So you mentioned bile. What that does is that it helps prepare it for absorption, and lipase, which is a digestive enzyme, helps break down fats, but then it needs to be absorbed further on in the intestines, usually in the small intestine where vitamin D is absorbed. And what if that small intestine is being destroyed, the ability to absorb? Anybody that has any stomach surgeries, like laparoscopy, for example, or bypass, gastric bypass, that is a massive issue. Gallbladder removals is very common and often, in our experience, not needed. And now you don't have the ability to produce any bile at the right time. It's just a slow drip coming out through the bile duct. So, we just mentioned right there so many limitations. So I think that the takeaway point is get it through exposure in the sun. And vitamin D deficiency, I'll say it again, is really a byproduct of a sunshine deficiency, which everybody in the northern hemisphere has. But we need to supplement in that case. And so we need to now look for ways of improving vitamin D absorption. So let's talk about that, Chantal. What are some considerations about the ways to optimize vitamin D, supplementation? Because I think after our discussion today, it's quite clear that this is one of the most important things we should be considering when we're taking vitamin D. What are some of the things that you're thinking about to optimize absorption?
Well, like first of all, suppress the interferers, like we've mentioned.
Right.
If you are taking medication that you might find alternatives for, medications that are not necessarily absolute necessity for you, try to find alternatives so that you don't interfere with the absorption. Get tested so you know where you're standing, and then use the proper form of supplementation. You've mentioned that vitamin D2 is not the optimal form, so you want to look for a vitamin D3. And again, Health Canada recommends between 4 and 800 IUs per day, depending on your age group and male, female, gender, and all of that. But like we've mentioned, scientifically speaking, people are recommending dosages much higher. So you won't really know where you stand until you get tested. So make sure you're taking proper form of supplementation. I prefer the liquid form because, again, it's easier to absorb. You were mentioning the inflammation in the digestive system, and that's such an important factor as well, because a lot of time people have this low-grade inflammation that is very pernicious because they may not have symptoms, but it will interfere not only with vitamin D, but all the B vitamins. We see this huge problem with, cognitive decline and Alzheimer and all these problems, which of course may depend on the fact that, like you've mentioned, statins are so widely used and our elders don't have the fats they need to, nourish their nervous system and their brain. But also vitamin B12 is so important
Yeah.
for to prevent cognitive decline, and any type of inflammation, like any level of inflammation you have in your gut, is going to affect vitamin B12 absorption. So uh, this is a big issue. So you have to make sure that you're looking at the underlying factors, such as any kind of gut inflammation that are often related to underlying intolerances, food intolerances. Gluten is obviously a very huge one. So that's something you might want to consider also, is to work with a clinician who's well versed in symptoms of gluten intolerances and can propose testing as well.
Right. Yeah, for sure. So you mentioned you have a preference for liquids versus dry caps. To your knowledge, is there any research showing the benefits of taking a liquid vitamin D versus something that you find in just capsules that's dry?
I don't have any research that I can think of right now, but it's just clinical experience. I see
Right.
that people will have like better results. They will reach an optimal level better and faster with liquid form. I really obviously like liquid vitamin D3 from AOR. It's D3, but it's still from a vegan source. We obtain it from sustainable organic lichen, and it's in triglyceride solution, so it's suspended in coconut oil. So I find it's very pleasing to taste. So it doesn't really have an aftertaste. It's easy to mix. So if you're giving it to children or if you're giving it to elders who might have difficulty swallowing capsules, also a very easy way to give it. And it's nice because it doesn't float like some other vitamins that I've tried before. So it's easily mixed with any beverage we take, or we can take it in food as well. So I've had very good results because, again, I use significant dosage and I test people on a regular basis, so I can see that this one is working well. But generally speaking, it's just easier for the body to process anything that's in a liquid form than if you're taking like a tablet, like where all these ingredients are, compressed together. It's obviously harder to digest.
That makes total sense, right? I mean, first of all, the amount of vitamin D that's found in like a multivitamin is not going to be anywhere near what you need. Secondly, all nutrients, they naturally will compete for absorption, right? It's just a matter of just physics in terms of what's available to be exposed to stomach acid and to enzymes and to certain receptor pathways. That's the way biochemistry works. So definitely, I totally agree with you. I recommend using a liquid form. And I thought you bring up an excellent point that's worth repeating. Not every form, even if it's liquid, is the same. You may not absorb it well. And so I've seen numerous just my anecdotal cases with my patients where they took even a form that I would think is good. It was a liquid, might have been something they picked up at a health food store. But when we retested them, there was no difference. So it may be that that particular liquid form is not a form that is high quality. I mean, that's one of the X factors. Like, for example, there is something that should be said about the stability and the potency of some of the nutrients that you're taking. Not every supplement, since we're supplement insiders, we understand this, we know the industry, not every supplement's created equal, even though if on paper and on the label it looks the same. I've seen a number of colleagues report that, we were using a form that is, considered to be high quality, yet we don't see anything budging. And when we switch to the AOR formula, we noticed a jump in their actual numbers. So something to consider, because vitamin D, if it's not properly stabilized, is actually going to degrade over time. And this is something that I've seen from my experience in the industry.
That's absolutely true, Paul. And, people think, yes, there can be like a special going on a specific product and you had a good price on the product, but generally speaking, you get what you pay for in this industry. It's not like somewhere else where you're just paying for the name brand. You actually pay for quality of supplements, and there are reasons behind that, and they usually have to do with the way that the molecules are processed and handled, but also like just plain dosage. I find it's a common problem with even a lot of people considered to be knowledgeable in our industry is they know, for example, roughly what vitamin D does and why vitamin D is important. They won't know what is an optimal dose. They will go with, what's recommended and minimal level. And that's something people really, really need to grasp is the difference between having minimum vitamin D, minimum vitamin C. You don't want to just not have a disease, but you want to perform at your optimal level. So a lot of times the problem is also with the dosage, not having the proper form of the vitamin and the dosage. Like I see that all the time with, for example, a conventional product, and they will add ginger in it or they will add ginseng in it just because, they know that people know about these herbs and it makes their product look more appealing. But when you look, they have 5 milligrams or 25 milligrams of the herb in it. So it's nowhere near a therapeutic dose, but the average person doesn't know that. They just know that, oh, ginger is good, it's anti-inflammatory, right? Or vitamin D is good, I have it in my multivitamin. Yes, they have 5 IUs and we're talking about 5,000 today. So, it's a matter of not having enough. And then again, we're back to biochemical individuality. If you don't know what your predispositions are, you might be taking 3,000 IUs every day, and you're taking that's a very high amount. It's 3 times the recommended amount by Health Canada, and still not reach your minimal amount if you have some of those polymorphism or genetic variations that impedes the proper utilization of your nutrients.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The kitchen sink approach of having more is better in a particular nutrient combination is sometimes with its risks. And so beware of cut rate supplements where there's definitely you pay for, you get what you pay for. And then, the dosing is a really important piece. And then also when you're taking it, remember, it's a fat soluble vitamin. So that means it should be taken with food when most of your bile and your digestive juices are secreted. A lot of my patients are like, "Well, I'm taking my vitamin D," and I ask them, "When are you taking it?" And I'm taking it, before I'm going to bed. I'm like, that's probably not the time you're going to get maximal absorption of it, even though it might be a liquid per se. So I think that these are just practical things to consider. One of the questions I get asked often, Chantel, is, who else needs more vitamin D? So we're talking about, maintenance and we're talking about, what is the optimal level. So let's assume that, our target is above 100 nanomoles per liter. I think you brought this piece of research to my attention from the University of Alberta. Can you speak to what Dr. Schwarfenberg and some of the information? I just think it's so impressive that people know the impact on our healthcare system if we just reach that optimal level.
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting research, especially since, as we've mentioned, Health Canada recommend or think that if we are above 50, we have sufficient vitamin D. And according to this doctor, he says that if all Canadians achieve that 100 nanomole per liter target, we would prevent 23,000 premature deaths and save $12.5 billion in healthcare annually. And with this COVID-19 situation we're facing, again, they're mentioning we're going to have another wave in the fall. And I'm thinking, vitamin D is a relatively cheap supplement. Like, why not recommend it to people? And we've been having a problem with elders and in homes in Quebec. We've had several losses from elders.
Everywhere in
Unfortunately.
Ontario too. Yeah.
Oh, it was the same in Ontario. I wasn't aware. And I'm thinking like, if we only supplemented that population, because of course they're not going outside, so they're not going to have that indigenous production. And right now, nobody's going outside, quite frankly. So we're all, severely depleted in vitamin D at the time where it is most critical that we should be supplementing with vitamin D. And, I think it would be an excellent government public health initiative because, like I've just mentioned, we would save 12.5 billion annually in healthcare. And it's not just that doctor. In terms of respiratory problems, even the World Health Organization mentions that if we are deficient in vitamin D, it predisposes us to having lung issues and all kinds of infections. So it's a well-known and well-accepted fact. So why not act in a preventive way and supplement the most at-risk population? And they're most at risk not only because they're not going outside, but because, Paul, the average Canadian elder is using 14 different drugs every day. I'm not talking 14 pills. I'm talking 14 different drugs. That combination, imagine how much chlorhydric acid you need to digest that. And on top of that, they're often put onto proton pump inhibitor or acid blocking medication. So, how are they going to absorb that vitamin D even from their food? And we're not even talking supplements. So I think that would be like the most sensible, the most economical approach to support everybody's immune system and overall well-being is to recommend even the bare minimum of 1,000 IUs of vitamin D per day.
Yeah, and make that a mandate because, one of the conversations I'm having with the people, that other practitioners and doctors in my circle is this concept of immune resilience, which is the body's ability to deal with, let's say a viral infection. And, I think understanding the way that influenza and other, upper respiratory tract infections, like what we're dealing with this current situation right now, it's not a matter of if I can prevent being exposed. At some point, the goal is herd immunity. We want our bodies to be able to handle it. And vitamin D is one of the most important things when it comes to immune resilience. It allows our immune system to function both preventatively and responsively. And that the two arms of the immune system that we talk about in immune resilience is the innate immune system, so that's like the first line of defense, and then there's the adaptive immune system. So, I mean, we could probably have a conversation that'll take an hour on this topic, which I think, at some point in the future we might have to do. But just for the sake of everybody listening, is that, vitamin D, as you mentioned, Chantal, makes so much sense on maintaining a healthy immune resilience, which is the ultimate goal. And then not to mention, when you're talking about a population that can really benefit from it, think of the immune function, yeah, but think of also elderly suffer with bone issues. Well, vitamin D is great for that. Elderly suffer for cognitive issues. That vitamin D helps with that. You go down the list: muscle function, strength, and the far-reaching applications of vitamin D is just makes it a perfect candidate for what you just described as, mandated, like make sure that people are getting their vitamin D levels up to optimal.
And you're mentioning excellent points, Paul. And the elders is probably the most vulnerable population. But like you've also mentioned earlier, even the kids, because you see, like one of my kid in practice had a titanium overload, and we started looking at where's getting the titanium, and the titanium was coming from the sun care cream, sun care lotion. And because the daycares, they just spray, they don't have time to go one by one for the kids. So they just spray the kids 3-4 times a day to protect them from the sun. So even children happen to be very vitamin D deficient unless the parents are well aware and make sure to expose their children to enough sunlight. But again, a lot of the children with all these allergies, allergies, autoimmune condition, we know diabetes is at an extremely high level among our teens, among our children. And like you've mentioned, vitamin D is an excellent immune regulator. It affects the inflammation as well. It will bring and suppress the inflammatory cytokines. So giving it to the children is also very important to support their immune system. Allergy season is going to be crazy because, as we know, with the confinement, people were not going outside, we're not taking care of their trees and lawns. And so the allergy season is probably going to be very, very extreme this year. And one of the ways to mitigate that would really be to support our vitamin D levels with adequate supplementation.
Yeah. I mentioned immune resilience, and I think that's what we're talking about when we're talking about our body's ability to ward off infections. But what you're talking about is immune tolerance. So it's kind of like the two sides of a teeter-totter, and the body needs to be able to do both. And the beauty about vitamin D is that it not only does the body's first line of defense, and it's also its second line of defense, its responsive defense, but it also balances an overreactivity. And so that's what you mentioned in terms of allergies and autoimmunity. I mean, you can find tons of published research on vitamin D's ability to modulate inflammation or balance inflammation in autoimmune conditions. Many of those conditions are deficient in vitamin D. Anything from thyroid autoimmunity to type 1 diabetes to allergies, which is basically the body over-responding to something it should normally see and not have that strong response to. So, I mean, I think all the listeners today really have a comprehensive understanding that vitamin D is something that's very important for them to consider. As you mentioned, all ages should be considering vitamin D, especially vulnerable populations from an immune perspective. And elderly is one that currently is a huge issue for us in this current pandemic situation we're dealing with, but also children and pregnant women and all through the ages. Test and then supplement and expose yourself to sun judiciously and then test again. So I think hopefully we've outlined with your help, Chantal, today a really good framework for understanding vitamin D, and I think people will understand how important it actually is. So I want to thank you for your input today.
Yes, Paul. I just want to mention one last thing because, because
Go ahead.
it's a fat soluble vitamin, people tend to be afraid of vitamin D. They think they're going to take too much if they go above the recommended 800 IUs. Just wanted to mention that according to the, hold on, sorry, I had I think it's the Institute of Medicine. Yeah, the Institute of Medicine, a study in 2010, and they mentioned that no negative effect was observed at doses of 10 IUs per day. So,
10,000, you mean 10,000.
what did I say?
I think you said 10 IUs, but yeah, it's 10,000.
Sorry,
That's okay.
10,000. Okay, you can just edit that part, no problem.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Yeah, and I've seen this research too, Chantel. Obviously, as we've said before, we need to work with, anybody that's going over Health Canada's doses. We always have to be considerate of their particular situation. But I have to tell you, just from my clinical experience, I have yet to see vitamin D toxicity of somebody that's doing a high dose. And if you're deficient, then you need more. Like that's the bottom line. And so work with a naturopathic doctor, work with a functional medicine a practitioner that understands and has access to testing, because you may not get to the optimal levels if you just get things at food-based doses, which is fortified, or at the basic doses. It just simply may not ever happen. So we need to be, evidence-based, and that includes not just research that's published at some university, that includes applying that to your life and using the evidence and testing that is available to us. Absolutely. So yes, thank you again for joining us. What a great bit of information we shared today. Absolutely invaluable for your clinical input here, Chantel. So I appreciate that. I know our listeners appreciate that. I appreciate your joining us, and we're going to definitely have to have you back very soon to talk about a number of the other things that we could probably spend another 2-3 hours discussing today.
Thank you, Paul. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, take care. Thanks everybody tuning in to Supplementing Health. Please join us again next week, and looking forward to exploring more about what's happening in our immune system and all the different things that you're going to keep yourself optimally supplemented. Take care. Thank you for listening today. For more information about our guests, past shows, and future topics, please visit aor.ca/podcasts. Do you have a topic that you want us to cover? We invite you to engage with us on social media to request a future topic, or email us at marketing@aor.ca. We hope you tune in again next week to learn more about supplementing your health.